I'm delighted to welcome everybody to the African Development Bank Group's webinar to present the African Economic Outlook 2022 to Asian audiences. My name is Yuna Che. I'm the External Relations and Communication Officer at the African Development Bank. The African Economic Outlook is the African Development Bank's premier flagship report that serves as a tool for economic intelligence, policy dialogue, and operational effectiveness. As we towards COP27 in November, which is Africa's COP, the theme of this year's African Economic Outlook, supporting climate resilience and a just energy transition in Africa, is perfectly timed. The report focuses on the pertinent and pressing topic of climate resilience and energy transition in Africa under the net zero carbon strategy. The subject is crucial for both Africa and Asia, considered two of the most vulnerable continents to climate change. This year's presentation will be the third webinar jointly organized by the African Development Bank's Asia External Representation Office and Macroeconomic Policy Forecasting and Research Department after successful events in 2020 and 2021, which saw very positive feedback from around 400 participants from across Africa and Asia. The agenda for today, it will be in three major segments. The first segment will be presented on African Economic Outlook 2022 by AFDB Vice President, Professor Kevin Rama. Then Dr. Bihar Dhawan, Director General of India's the Energy and Research Institute called TERI, will talk about the pathway and role of Asia. And Dr. Jung-woo Kim, Executive Director of the Korea Development Institute called KDI, will give a presentation about climate change and a just energy transition in Africa, implication for development cooperation with Korea. And then we will have a discussion and Q&A session finally. Okay, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Here he is. Let's welcome Mr. Takashi Hanajiri, Head of the African Development Bank, Asia External Representation Office, to deliver his opening remarks. Mr. Hanajiri.
Thank you, Yuna-san. Dear sirs and madams, it is a great honor and privilege to invite such distinguished guests, commentators, and participants to the 2022 African Economic Outlook, or AEO, webinar for Asian audiences today. I'm Hanajiri, Head and Director of the Asia External Representation Office of the African Development Bank, or AFDB. I will be brief. I would like to express my gratitude to you all as an organizer, and also like to thank my dear Vice President and colleagues of the Macroeconomic Policy Forecasting and Research Department and our Asia office of the AFDB for arranging this event to take place. This year, AEO's theme is supporting climate resilience and a just energy transition in Africa, focusing on the urgent issue of the climate resilience and energy transition, especially in the context of the recent global conflicts, extreme climate conditions, and economic instability worldwide. Finding ways for international cooperation for sustainable long-term prosperity are needed the most. Africa is the most vulnerable continent to climate change, most punished by its adverse effect, despite having contributed the least to global warming. However, the continent is not alone. All of us have felt the devastating effects of destructive climate events, such as extreme heat waves, hurricanes, typhoons, cyclones, floods, droughts, that are becoming more and more common. These threats are too gigantic for any single country to cope alone. In the world where all countries' effects ripple across borders. Another challenge is energy transition in Africa. When it comes to just energy transition, while it is essential for the Africa carry its fair share of commitment of climate goals, it is necessary that Africa be given the energy transition to balance its development goals and climate objectives accordingly. The transition to clean energy needs to open new opportunities that can drive socio-economic benefits, social inclusivity, and empowerment by bringing new policy, technology, and financing, particularly from private sector. Therefore, I believe today's event will provide a great opportunity to discuss potential pathways and solutions for Africa and Asia together to seek for innovative strategies and means to achieve more sustainable, more just, and greener development for thriving economy. The AEO has been the AFDB's core report for economic intelligence and policy dialogue. I hope this will be a platform for everyone. I mean, government officials, agencies, members of the African Diplomatic Corps in Asia, development practitioners, private sector, civil society, scholars, journalists, and the general public who have all gathered today to share different perspectives, knowledge, and experiences. I would like to open today's event with a hopeful prospect for the bright future of the vibrant relationship between Asia and Africa, and the AFDB as an important contributor and facilitator of that relationship. I look forward to Professor Kevin Chika Urama's gorgeous presentation of the key highlights of the report, and also Dr. Bibha Dwaha from Energy and Resources Institute of India, and Dr. Jo Kim from Korea Development Institute, who graciously agreed to share their insights today. That's it. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Back to you, Yuna-san.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hanajiri, for your insightful and also encouraging remarks to our participants. Now, I would like to welcome Vice President, Professor Kevin Urama, to deliver his presentation on the 2022 African Economic Outlook. Let me introduce the Vice President briefly. The Professor Kevin Chika Urama is currently acting Chief Economist and Vice President of the Economic Governance and Knowledge Management Complex, and the Senior Director of the African Development Institute at the African Development Bank Group. He was a senior advisor to the President of the African Development Bank Group on inclusive and green growth strategy, policy development, and implementation. VP Urama is responsible for shaping and leading the bank-wide capacity development in the regional member countries to accelerate the delivery of the high five priorities of the African Development Bank, SDGs, and African Union's Agenda 2063. He is also an elected fellow of the African Academy of Science and extraordinary professor at the Stellenbosch University in South Africa, adjunct professor at the Model University in Western Australia. He was visiting professor at the Department of Science, Technology, Energy, and Public Policy at the University College London. Professor Urama has held various executive leadership positions in academia, international organization, and the private sector. He serves on various boards and international global research committees to deliver inclusive green growth and sustainable development. Vice President Professor Urama is currently on a mission in the US. However, he's now with us for today's momentous event with Asia, although it is now 4 a.m. in Washington, D.C. Thank you once again, Vice President. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, my sister Yuna, and my brother Hanajiri, for your organization of this meeting. And thank you to all the panelists and all the delegates for joining. I'd also like to thank my colleagues from the Macroeconomic Policy Focusing and Research Department, Anthony Simpasa, Adamon, and all the colleagues who worked really very hard to make this report that we're going to be presenting a reality. I'd also like to bring to you, to the Asian continent, the greetings of Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, the president of the African Development Bank Group, under whose guidance and leadership this report was written. He would have been with us to grace this occasion, except that there are so many other pressing Africa's development challenges that he's always addressing. So I bring you his greetings. My presentation will focus on the report that has been so ably introduced by Hanijiri and Yuna on basically looking at supporting climate resilience and just energy transitions in Africa. This theme in itself was selected because of the interlocking challenges that Africa faces in trying to grow its economy, which requires universal access to electricity, SDG 7, while making sure that Africa plays its fair share in ensuring our global planetary sustainability by not exceeding its carbon budget, i.e., ensuring that Africa's growth pathway is a green transition pathway, but not dragging the progress that Africa has been making with regard to accelerating development and the welfare of its people. And for that reason, the report was structured in 3 main chapters. The first chapter will look at economic performance and outlook of the continent in the short and medium term. We also then went into looking at the chapter on climate resilience and just energy transition in Africa. What does it really mean when we say climate resilience in Africa, in a continent that has not really contributed much to that global commons challenge we now call climate change? Now, what does it mean for Africa to be able to be climate resilient and climate compliant while ensuring that just energy transition? What does that justice mean in the context of the global community, in the context of technology sharing and knowledge sharing, in the context of climate finance, and all the rest of the trade-offs that needs to be considered in that particular transition? And then in chapter 3, we address the major issue around financing, because we know that development as we know it today is driven by financing. So we talk about financing the climate resilience and that just energy transition in Africa. What strategies and instruments are available at the African continent's national government's remit, at the global remit, and also for multilateral development banks and DFIs and others who are charged to addressing these global challenges that Africa and the rest of the world faces. Then we home in on policy recommendations and some conclusions, which I have to say are just like teasers with regard to what needs to be done, so that when we go to this COP27 and all the continuous conversations that we've been having as a global community on saving our global commons, we will be able to be discussing those things based on knowledge, based on science, based on facts, and not sentiments or political interests or even national interests. Because as His Excellency Kofi Annan, our premier, former statesman from Africa, the former Secretary General for the United Nations, rightly described this issue. He says we are all on the same boat in this. So we cannot sit on one side of the boat and pretend that the holes on the other boat does not affect us. So it's a global commons challenge that we all need to work together to address in order to save our common humanity, our common planet, and our common future together as one. So let me just go into the first chapter, Africa's economic performance and outlook. So on this graph, you see that growth performance in Africa has, as always, been very resilient. We saw a contraction in Africa just before COVID-19. If I talk about before this 2019, you see on the picture here, Africa has had a good spiraling of growth upwards, up to 4.6% on average between 2020 and 2019. That was a good thing. But then the COVID-19 came in, and Africa, just like the rest of the world, the red line you see there is Africa. Africa saw a contraction in its GDP up to 1.6% in 2020 due to COVID-19 impacts. But as a resilient continent, the growth in Africa rebounded to 6.9% in 2021. But again, as we have seen in many economic cycles, Africa is very, very vulnerable to global shocks. After COVID-19, we've seen these global tensions, the Russia-Ukraine war, and the tightening of fiscal policy in the United States that is strengthening the dollar and creating a lot of transmissions, negative impacts on different economies, including Africa, like imported inflation. So our projection is that Africa's growth will go down to around 4.5% or 4.1% between in 2020 and stay in 2022 and stay the same way in 2023. But keep in mind that these estimates were done in February 2020 when the Russia-Ukraine war was just beginning. So these estimates in terms of the growth prospects of the continent has a lot of uncertainties within it, including COVID-19. How does it play out, given that Africa's share in terms of the share of population that is vaccinated is still low? And how does the Russia-Ukraine war play out in terms of its knock-on effects on energy prices, on food prices, on inflation, and so on? And how does the contraction, the tightening of fiscal and monetary policies around the world transmit through trade and trade disruptions and other things, and also inflationary impacts on the continent? So we are positive, hoping that these impacts will not deepen the growth prospects of the continent. Now, but what pleases me specifically is looking at the disaggregated figures on the continent, because Africa is a large continent with several countries at different levels of development, different economic structures, and different realities. But when you try to disaggregate this growth picture in Africa, on the left side here, you see the regional disaggregation of these analyses. And you see a very beautiful picture. One is North Africa that saw a contraction of minus 1.3% in 2020 because of COVID-19, saw a big rebound in its growth to 11.7 in 2020 because of a number of good macroeconomic policies and fiscal policy responses that we saw in that region of the continent. But again, because of these overlapping shocks, that growth projection is projected to decelerate to 4.5% and 4.2% in 2022 and 2023, respectively. But that's still a positive picture. Then we think about South Africa, that the Southern Africa region that saw the biggest hit on COVID-19, seeing a contraction in its GDP growth by minus 6%. But again, we see a good rebound to 4.2%, but will be projected to remain at 2.5 and 2.4% respectively in 2022 and 2023. Now, West Africa was not extremely hit by the COVID-19 because of the structure of the economy and so on and so forth, but it saw a contraction of 0.6%, but a rebound to 4.3% and maybe remaining above 4% in 2021 and 2022 and 2023. Now, Central Africa's story is similar, and we see an upward trajectory in the growth in that region in 2023 and 2022 and 2023. Now, a very interesting region to look at is Eastern Africa, the only region on the continent that did not see a contraction on average because of COVID-19. Again, because of several policies that these countries were able to implement to respond to the COVID-19, but also the built-up structure in the economy due to good macroeconomic policy management that has been happening in that region. And we see that, of course, the growth was decelerated, but it didn't go to negative figures. So it grew at 1.5% in 2020, and we're seeing an upward trajectory of above 4.5% in 2022 and 2023. So we even expect that it will grow up to 5.5% by 2023. Then we know that Africa's economies have different structures depending on the sources of growth. So if you look at the structural differences on the right-hand side there, you find that countries that were dependent on external inflows because of tourism and so on were hardest hit by COVID-19, seeing a contraction of almost 13% in 2020. But again, that same set of countries has rebounded to above 4% and will remain above 4%. So whether it's oil exporters or resource-intensive economies and non-resource intensive economies, or even countries we call low-income and middle-income countries, we see a good picture on the continent that the economies were resilient and were able to bolster the shock of COVID-19. But some macroeconomic fundamentals that like debt vulnerabilities and inflationary pressures remain a big concern on the continent. In addition to that COVID vaccination that I've talked about and the changes that is happening in the global economy, including the geopolitical tensions that are having pass-through effects through trade and other variables that we've talked about. Well, let's just pick two of them. One is the gross government debt as a percentage of GDP. If you look at this picture, I want to make 2 points here. One is that COVID-19 was not the major source of the rising in debt vulnerabilities on the continent. We've seen the rise starting from 2010, really going almost 70% of GDP before we had the COVID-19. Of course, COVID-19 exacerbated the challenge. And another good point I want to make here is that you see how there was some changes in terms of slowing down and some kind of upward trends in the debt trajectories in Africa, and this in 2021 and 2022, and this was because of the effects of the global actions that were taken during the COVID-19. The DSSI initiative, that's the debt service suspension initiative, and also the promise of the common framework, and also the SDRs allocation by the IMF that created some fiscal buffers for the countries during that period. But the interesting thing to see here is that immediately after these, especially the DSSI initiative was ended in 2021, December 2021, the debt trajectory has started going up again. So that tells me that there is a lot more that needs to be done by the global community in terms of structural reforms on how debt is structured, and then also debt resolution and debt forgiveness, if I dare say, that is required. But also there are so many things that African countries need to do, prudent public financial management and so on. And the African Development Bank Group has responded to these challenges through several actions, but I will talk only of two because of time. One is the Debt Action Plan, which is a short-term action plan that the African Development Bank is taking to support countries that are in debt distress and the more vulnerable countries. But again, we have a longer term strategy action that we call the Africa Public Financial Management Academy, through which we are helping countries to turn debt from all these discussions about debt vulnerability and sustainability to debt productivity. You can find a lot more about these actions of the bank on the bank's website. On the right side here, you see the consumer price inflationary pressures that built up in 2020 and in 2021 following COVID-19. This picture has changed significantly on the upward side because of the additional pressures that were created by the Russia-Ukraine war, and also, more interestingly, by the policy tightening in the United States and around the world with regard to pass-through inflation, imported inflation is called. Of course, discussing all these, we have to think about financing. How is the continent going to recover, and what will it take for the continent to recover from COVID-19? Without delving into depth because of time, our estimates was that at that time, that Africa would require about $432 billion between 2020 and 2022 alone to address the COVID-19 impact and economic recovery programs. And even if that resources were made available, which we know is not made available yet to the continent, catching up to the pre-COVID-19 and pre-Russia-Ukraine conflict poverty recovery rates in Africa will take up to a decade. So put simply, the COVID-19 and the early phases of Russia-Ukraine war set Africa's poverty reduction, which is SDG goal 1, progress back by a decade. So even if we have the resources, it will take almost a decade to be able to recover. But those are just the numbers of Africans who have been pushed further down into abject poverty because of these shocks. 28.7 million people in 2021, 29.6 million people in 2022 and 2023. And because of the Russia-Ukraine war, we expect around additional 2 million people to be pushed into abject poverty. So this story on economic outlook of the continent is a mixed picture, as usual. One, the economies are very resilient and we're able to absorb the shocks. Two, there are several uncertainties that are beyond the capacity of the countries to address due to global tensions, global policy movements, volatility in the global markets, and several other things, and also debt and debt sustainability challenges, inflation, and several other things that we've talked about. But again, you see that there are also several things that African countries themselves can do to help themselves, which we have talked about. You can read a lot more about that in the report. Then we looked into the second chapter, which is climate resilience and just energy transitions in Africa. What does this mean? If Africa wants to come out of this continued volatility in its growth, it needs SDG 7 to be implemented fully, universal access to electricity, for several reasons. But doing that also means that Africa needs to be considerate of where the world is today and the realities of the implications of energy transitions on global sustainability. Because again, like our statesman told us, we're all in the same boat. So we looked at climate vulnerability, climate readiness, and climate resilience in Africa and around the world. And we find that South Asia is more climate vulnerable than Africa, Africa coming second in the world in that regard. But even that South Asia that is more vulnerable than Africa to climate change because of its physical locations and geographical locations and other realities that makes them more vulnerable. They are also more ready to adapt to climate impacts than Africa. So Africa is the least ready continent. So this already triggered questions in me. What is South Asia doing that Africa is not doing? And what can Africa learn from South Asia in terms of becoming more ready to adapt to climate change impacts, even though South Asia geographically is more vulnerable than Africa. But when we look at climate resilience, which is a combination of the vulnerability and readiness, we find that Africa is the least resilient continent in the whole world. And not just least resilient continent, it's by so much in terms of the lack of resilience on the continent. Now, if you look at the continent itself to start addressing that question of what is Asia doing, what is the rest of the world doing that Africa is not doing, then you find that also there are several good examples in Africa on countries that has built economic structures that makes it readier to address climate change and to be less vulnerable to climate change. So that led us to some immediate conclusions coming at this from the economic lens, that economic structures matter for climate resilience and climate adaptation. So building the economies of countries that are very vulnerable to climate change is actually a climate policy for several reasons that I'm going to come back to. So on the other side of the coin, that taking policies that slows down economic growth in Africa is not a good climate policy. So we need to go back to that as when we start addressing the impacts and the interplay between climate and energy transitions. Then we looked at the obvious question: what are the impacts of this climate change on the continent, the socioeconomic impacts? And we find that Africa is already losing 5 to 15% of its GDP per capita growth between 1996 and 2015 because of climate change. Now, this is a huge number. 5 to 15% of a continent's growth is being lost because of climate change. So this is why, after looking at this report, I started calling climate change the major existential threat to the continent. But this is in addition to increased mortality, some of which are not recorded, the climate-induced conflicts. We are seeing a lot of conflicts on Africa that is because of drying out of Lake Chad and the rest of them, and also conflict that has been created by the human displacements because of climate change, but also intra-regional and rural-urban migration and international migration that's also being driven by climate change. So to address all these requires significant financial investments, cost-benefit analysis, and also trade-off analysis. So climate policy in Africa is not simply talking about energy transitions. It's not simply talking about CO2 emissions. It's a very clear interplay of economic growth policies, poverty alleviation policies, health policies, and all these policies with the climate objective, so that we are not creating trade-offs that makes climate policy unpalatable for citizens and also for countries. So, but when we try to do cost-benefit analysis, you find that climate resilience, building climate resilience has multiple advantages beyond the costs of not doing it on the continent. So, but then this raises the question of climate justice and just energy transitions. And also, how do we focus on addressing climate change, and what are the knock-on effects on achieving other SDG goals? And if you did a correlation of per capita electricity consumption and GDP per capita, this is the one you see on the picture. You see like almost a one-to-one correlation. You do it with HDI index, you find the same thing. So to some extent, you can find that access to energy is a clear proxy for GDP growth on the continent. And if you try it around the world, you find exactly the same thing. So the challenge here is we know that SDG 7 requires universal access to electricity, but we know that climate action requires a reduction in CO2 emissions. If you did this mapping also with growth, GDP, and CO2 emissions, you find almost a similar perfect correlation. So we went deep to say, okay, how are countries making this transition and what would it mean for the rest of the world? And if you look at that energy mix of selected regions of the world, we have Africa, we have China, European Union, India, and United States, where we had the data. If you take this analysis back to the 1850s, you find a very similar, some similar conclusions. One, energy transition takes time. So it is not it actually takes decades to be able to have a decay function between using coal, which is highly polluting, to other less polluting energy sources. So the policy of trying to say, okay, stop doing one or two energy sources in order to be climate resilient might not be a wise option. Second, most of the transitions we have seen in Africa, in European Union and United States were driven by moving away from coal to gas. And in European Union and United States, in addition, that red bars you see there is nuclear. So, but Africa is not having the capacity to do nuclear energy for several reasons. It has the capacity on gas. So natural gas is a very clear transition fuel that must be part of the energy mix if the world wants to transition to lesser polluting energy systems. Then the green bars on top there is renewable energy. To be honest, as a renewable energy enthusiast, I was a bit disappointed to find out that even in the European Union, where we have had a lot of policies and a lot of efforts to transition to this technology, it is still about 28% of the energy mix on average in the European Union. Again, for obvious reasons. In the United States, it's much less. In Africa, it's also not going as fast as we expect it to be. But in most countries in Asia, it's also not going as much as we expect it to be. So the share of renewable energy in the energy mix needs to be ramped up significantly. But again, that takes financing. It takes knowledge sharing. It takes technology sharing, and so on. But the beautiful story here is that Africa's energy mix, based on our analysis, is amongst the least carbon intensive in the world. So again, that tells me that trying to drive energy transitions in Africa that slows down economic growth is not good for growth, it's not good for society, it's also not good for climate. So that's another conclusion from that analysis. So what does just energy transitions then mean in the lens of the Paris Agreement, especially with regards to its common but differentiated responsibilities? So we looked at the carbon budget of the world. What does it take for the world to stay within, to achieve the net zero goals? And we find that it takes per capita 2 tons of CO2 equivalent for if the whole world will remain within the global carbon budget. We find that 85% of the global carbon budget is already used up. So it's an existential threat for the whole world if we continue to emit CO2 emissions in order to drive growth. But we find that for Africa, the per capita footprint in terms of average carbon footprint is still within 0.95 tons of CO2 equivalent. While achieving that net zero means 2 tons of CO2 equivalent per capita, that simply leads to a very clear conclusion here that Africa still has large headrooms to meet CO2 without compromising the climate agreement of the world in per capita terms. But when we did this analysis for other regions of the world, you'll find that some countries like where I'm sitting in the United States has already consumed 14 tons per capita. In Europe, it's about 7 tons per capita. And in several countries around the world, you find that there is carbon deficit already. It's a carbon debt to the world. But for countries like Africa, you will see on the right side of this graph, you still have some carbon credit. So if I talk about the right side of the graph a little bit, you find that United States, and that the figures you see there is if you use the social cost of carbon to transfer the carbon credit and carbon debt into basically in the carbon markets. So if we use the social cost of carbon, which is a conservative estimate, this is how much of carbon debt different countries and regions of the world owes the world, and how much of carbon credit different countries of the world still has to remain within the carbon budget of the world. If I looked at Japan, the carbon debt of Japan is still small. It's not as much as that of the United States or China or the EU 27 countries, and even Russia. But countries like India, Africa, and the rest of the world has carbon credits that, if the climate finance architecture were well set up, it was supposed to mean this transfer of resources between countries in order to be able to achieve the net zero, which is our global commons challenge that requires global action by all actors around the world. So that is justice, and that is fairness in the energy transitions of the world. Now, for Africa, translating that means that Africa has an estimated carbon credit of 4.64 trillion US dollars between 2022 and 2050. This means that Africa alone requires a climate finance inflow of up to 173 billion US dollars annually. And keep in mind that the whole world has been discussing 100 billion for the whole developing countries. And even that commitment has not yet been met. So two things that came out of this analysis is that if we really want to get real about climate finance, the magnitude and scale of climate finance is totally far from what it's supposed to be, including what we have been discussing, the 100 billion. I don't know where that number came from. I know it comes from negotiators, but then I don't know if the negotiators used any real analysis to come to that number. So that also then leads me to a few conclusions that we'll come to. If we want to get real about climate change, we need to get real about climate finance flows, because the climate agreement we reached in COP21 included that climate finance flows as a condition for countries meeting their NDCs. So we can't close our eyes about the climate finance flows that are due to countries and expect them to be able to make the transitions that we're looking for. So that's one big thing we need to conclude there. But in Africa, this doesn't mean that Africa should go cap in hand saying, give us our 4.6 trillion or we will not do climate action, because climate change is already an existential challenge for the continent. High-risk events is happening more frequently, and we're losing up to 15% of GDP in some countries, and the loss of lives and so on. So it's an existential threat that Africa must take action in order to address. So where are the opportunities? In the just transitions, the opportunities for Africa are abound, just like it has been in other development transitions. Africa is very rich in green minerals, the components of the green transitions, products, and services. And I've just listed a lot of them there, and there's quite a lot more. That's why you see ... at the end of each of those. So Africa is so rich in these resources that are supposed to be the bedrock of the green transitions. So how does African governments take advantage of this to become leader in the new development paradigm that is evolving? Because the technology shifts, the market shifts, and the policy shifts will make continued investments in high carbon emitting energy sources. We'll have two things that will happen. You will have transition risks there, but you will also have asset stranding risks there. So it doesn't make good policy for Africa to say, let us continue to invest in high carbon emitting energy sources, because Africa has the opportunity to build out the renewable energy sources, but also to benefit hugely from the green development minerals that it has so much. But the short-changing factor there is finance. So from this story, there are three things that already has come out. We have COVID, we have conflicts, we have climate change that are triple C's affecting Africa's growth. But for me, if I also use the words of President Adesina, we have three F's that will address that: finance, finance, and finance. And without addressing that finance question, it will be challenging for Africa to move forward. And that is why this report focused on the third chapter on financing climate resilience and just energy transitions for Africa. What are the strategies? What are the options? How can we make it happen? And we found a number of things that are very worrying. One, the climate finance structure is complicated and loosely defined. And because of that complication and loose definition, it makes it easy for countries to climate wash several development SDG financing options, including ODA, and also use different tools like debt financing to support climate transitions and call it climate finance. So it becomes very challenging to see how countries who are already vulnerable to climate impacts, who are already poor, so they are vulnerable to global shocks, are also being made even more vulnerable by giving them debt financing as climate financing, or using ODA resources that are supposed to address SDG 1 to focus on SDG 13, which is climate action. So that creates trade-offs between different SDG goals and climate change, and makes climate change, if I should say, less palatable for policymakers to address. So we need policies that juxtaposes all the SDGs and is not creating such trade-offs. So in that point, we make a conclusion that climate financing must be new and additional. It mustn't be climate washing other existing development financing options. Then the second finding there is that climate finance is misaligned with climate vulnerability. And that's the picture you see on the left side there. The more climate vulnerable countries do not have the economic structures and capacity to access climate finance. So the climate finance flows are going to countries that are higher emitters. So it looks as if climate financing is structured to benefit emitters. So the more resilient, resilient you are, the more you can access climate finance. This also tells me that there is need for the world to look at alternative options to get this climate finance to countries that require it the most. Because even if we increase climate finance scale, as we've talked about, it's likely to continue to go to countries that have the capacity to access it. And those are not the climate vulnerable countries. And that is why we are proposing in the African Development Bank a climate action window of the African Development Fund, which is a concessional window of the bank that has been tested and proven to provide access to finance at concessional rates and as grants to these climate vulnerable countries. So replenishing that fund significantly and supporting the climate action window that we have created in that fund will help to channel climate finance to where it's needed, and not basically trying to reward emitters by giving them more climate finance. And the time is ticking, so let me go into the scale of the climate financing, which we have already talked about, highly misaligned with the needs that we have. So if we looked at only focusing not on the climate, the carbon credits of Africa, which is 4.64 trillion, but talking about, okay, let's get real. How much does it cost Africa to implement the NDCs that was part of the climate agreement in Paris? It will cost Africa up to $1.6 trillion between now and 2030. This means that on average, Africa will need up to $145 billion annually in order to implement the NDCs alone between now and 2030. But on average, our calculations show that Africa is receiving around 18.4 billion in climate finance. And this includes the debt instruments, includes the rebranded ODA, it includes funding from the African Development Bank Group, which the African countries are also shareholders in. So if you really try to look at real climate finance flows, it's much, much, much less than this figure. But even if we take that figure to be the climate finance, even though I don't agree completely, because there's a lot of double counting there and miscounting there, then you find that Africa has over 108 billion US dollars in climate finance gap between now and 2030. Keep in mind that the whole world is talking about 100 billion for all the developing countries, and we have not met it. But Africa alone needs over 108 billion to be able to address the NDCs alone. That means if this current trend continues, there is no way we can pretend or even contemplate that Africa will meet its NDCs. So what does this mean for African countries? There is a lot of need for policy coordination. And I've talked about coordination between monetary policy and fiscal policies, but also coordination among sectoral policies to ensure that we don't create these trade-offs that we're seeing evolving with regard to focusing on climate resilience alone. We need to build and strengthen value chains. Someone will ask me, value chains in climate finance, why? Because in Africa, a lot of the climate of the carbon emissions actually comes from the embedded carbon in products. And also, if you look at the life cycle of products, even the green technologies are not very climate neutral in Africa. Why? They are taken from sources of raw materials, distant countries, on ships that run on oil and gas, and then come back again, the final product. So if you put all the carbon emissions that are involved in producing even solar panels, they are not carbon neutral in Africa. So regionalizing those value chains and creating these technologies in areas where the raw materials exist will cut that CO2 emissions embedded in the export and import of the product, but it will also create jobs. It will achieve the triple goals of serving society, improving the economy, and also reducing CO2 emissions. Now we need to scale investments massively in the renewable energy and green technologies that I have talked about. For me, it's not because of climate change that African countries should invest in this. It is because of market competitiveness, comparative advantage, and opportunities in the new market transitions that we are seeing. And also it is because of the asset stranding risks and the market risk involved in trying to continue in the old way. The markets are shifting, the policies are shifting, the technologies are shifting. Let's go with the flow or we'll be left behind. We need to invest in institutional capacity for development of these green transition technologies and products. Because one of the challenges of the continent has always been not being able to participate because of lack of soft infrastructure on the continent. We get loans to build hard infrastructure and we remain indebted for that hard infrastructure, and we don't have the education, the skills, the capacity even to maintain some of those infrastructure. So investing heavily on soft infrastructure becomes a very good climate policy for Africa. And this is why the African Development Bank is currently working on a knowledge and capacity development fund for Africa to focus largely on this soft infrastructure development on the continent. Now, policy recommendations for the rest of the world and the MDBs and development finance institutions. For me, it's about building trust. When we go to COP27, at the basic minimum, let us stand tall and meet the 100 billion climate finance commitment that was made. As I've mentioned, that commitment made to the whole of the developing countries is not enough for Africa alone. That means that beyond meeting that commitment, we also need to think about this misalignment in climate finance flows to Africa and think of how to ring-fence some of that resources to go to the fragile countries in Africa by channeling it through the African Development Fund. Then we also need to think about what does it actually mean to get the NDCs implemented, because climate adaptation is not an incremental action. If you are building a flood defense and you build it 99%, you have not built it because the flood will still come and destroy lives and property. So we need to scale up climate financing to meet the needs so that we'll be able to make them effective. We need to expand and deepen innovative financing instruments and leveraging private sector finance, see how MDBs and public sector resources can be used to de-risk financing for some of these existential challenges, because the existing financing architecture we have doesn't seem to have served us so well, especially in addressing these global commons challenges that we've all been facing. But finally, we need to increase concessional low-cost financing to support climate adaptation and just energy transitions in developing countries, especially in Africa, because without that, we are not going to be able to reach the Paris Climate Agreement that we've all agreed on. In conclusion, let's keep in mind where I started. Climate change is a global commons challenge, just like COVID-19. So having climate impacts anywhere means having climate impacts everywhere, because CO2 emissions mix freely in the atmosphere, and the impacts of that emissions is geography agnostic. It doesn't really know which boundaries and who emitted it, who didn't emit it. That's not its question. So emissions in Africa, if Africa is not helped, and emission by providing technologies, knowledge, and finance, and Africa starts emitting more CO2 emissions, it doesn't matter how much policies we have in the United States or in Japan on climate, we will all still be vulnerable to climate impacts as a global community. So it's not a question of aid, it's not a question of trade, it's a question of survival for the whole planet. So we need to think about policies that will allow for that redistribution of incomes to allow the countries that still don't have access to technologies to get that access to technologies to move forward. But in energy transitions, the conclusions we draw is that energy systems need to be technologically adequate. And that means you don't give someone light when he needs his energy to power micro and medium scale industries to increase incomes. Maybe the person in some rural villages in Kenya, when I was doing research on energy transitions, one woman told me, what I need is not your light. I have 12 hours of light already. And the other 12 hours I'm supposed to be sleeping. So what I really need is how to power farming so that I have small technologies, the motorized technologies that allows me to do my farming better, to do better irrigation, to start a small scale industry, and so on. So let's not just consider renewable energies as the solution, the only solution. It's part of the solution, but not everything. Technological adequacy is important. Then cost optimal in terms of, and this is where renewable energy has a huge advantage because the costs, unit costs are going down. But it has to be viable in driving growth. It has to be viable in driving sustainable transitions. It has to be viable in terms of the energy needs of the society that we're talking about, because energy systems and energy services are not fungible. You cannot say because you have light, you don't need cooling, or that because you have light, you don't need transportation and transport systems for mobility and so on. Decentralized energy systems is key, and I've talked about it, and we need to get real about climate financing. Discussing 100 billion and not meeting it doesn't meet the mark, because what Africa alone needs is 1.6 trillion to be able to implement the NDCs, which was agreed in COP21, the Paris Climate Agreement. And climate finance and technology flows was part of that agreement. And if I recall very well, there was the agreement that 80% of the financing for the NDCs will be conditional. It must come from these climate financing structures. So if that is not happening, we are not moving forward. But let me conclude by just sharing 3 words. One is from Einstein. We cannot use the old map to chart the new world. We cannot use the old map to chart the new world. That's number one. Two, we cannot, in the midst of all these challenges, lies opportunities for innovation. And the human ingenuity to innovate is unfathomable. So let's not say there are so much challenges, we can address it. Then another one that I want to cite is from Mr. Olsen, which is from a Norwegian scholar. And he talked about the trade-offs that needs to be made when we are addressing these challenges of climate change and common social problems. We need to make sure it must involve redistribution of resources. If we don't face that challenge, we will not be able to get real about climate change and the climate challenge. Let's act together and save our planet together. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Vice President Professor Kevin Orama, for this insightful presentation and the solutions. And I believe your presentation and speech impressed those present in Asia and in Africa as well. I hope our participants now have a good understanding and analysis about this year's economic situation in Africa, and how more vital collaboration and business ties between Africa and Asia would help gear up for upcoming COP27, which is Africa's COP, discussion and negotiation in the right direction, as well as make a recovery in both continents more durable. So let us move to the next session. It's a presentation session delivered by Asian eminent scholar. I wanted to welcome Dr. Bihap Dhawan to share her view. Let me briefly introduce about Dr. Bihap Dhawan. She is the Director General of India's premier research institute, the Energy and Resources Institute, called TERI. Dr. Dhawan has been associated with TERI since 1985. Dr. Dhawan is actively involved in research as well as policy development at the national and international level. Dr. Dhawan is a well-published researcher and has been instrumental in the establishment of the highly successful micropropagation technology park at TERI. And also, Dr. Dhawan is the winner of the Indian Women Achievers Summit 2017, Women Leadership Agriculture Award 2016 by Indian Council of Food and Agriculture, and also the first Biotech Product and Process Development and Commercialization Award of the Department of Biotechnology in 2000. So it is our great honor to have you today, Dr. Dhawan. The floor is yours now.
Thank you so much. And after this excellent presentation by Professor Kevin Orama, I don't know what to say because it was so elaborate, it covered every aspect and right from where the problem lies and where are the solutions. So thank you, Professor Orama, for making my job very simple because you have said it all. Let me put the screen on. So it's very clear when we are discussing about or what was just mentioned. So what I'm going to cover in my discussion is that what are the impacts of climate change? We all are observing that. A decade before, we had to convince people that it's a threat, but today, whatever is happening around, we can attribute more than 80% of that to the changing climate. Both Asia and Africa, I should say, we have more or less similar problems. Quite many of them are exactly same. Of course, no two, even within the country also you find variability. So there is some variability. But at the same time, if we say the similarities are much more, and therefore we can work together to look for solutions. And of course, it goes without saying that the technologies of yesterday are not going to work today. And so is true with the energy, the way we used to generate energy, use energy, and it's going to change in the near future. And I'm a very optimistic person, and many years back when we were talking about that the existing supply of petrol and diesel perhaps will take us till 2025. And I always used to say before that we will have solutions. And really speaking, the way we are today, it can well be that whatever is remaining in the oil wells, perhaps that's going to remain there only, and we'll have much cleaner options in very near future. So when we talk of climate change, next one, we are talking about, as also mentioned by Kevin, that we are talking of not just change in the climate, because the impact of climate change, it is on every sphere of life. This year, even in city like Delhi, the temperature has crossed 50 degrees centigrade, which is very, very high. Earlier, it used to be a couple of days with 45 or so, but then this year it was really very hot. And this rise in temperature has also resulted in delayed monsoon. Now, delayed monsoon then had impact on harvesting of paddy, because the grain must dry before you harvest paddy. And we have very short window between harvesting of paddy and sowing of wheat. So that window got further shrunk, because now is the time we haven't harvested 100% of paddy, and wheat sowing has also started. We talk about the warming of ocean. Now, again, it is going to have impact on entire biodiversity. It is going to impact fish, because that is something which we consume as food. It's going to have impact on microflora as a whole. So what kind of food will be available to the fish, and so on. And the same cities within the country, they have drought at one time, and then they have floods. So in a way, it is that you have a vicious cycle of droughts and floods happening in the same year, in the same region. So which is causing further problem, because we talk about selecting varieties, plant varieties, which will survive in drought, but then what happens with standing water? So there is a total confusion, which again is impacting our crop productivity. We also discussed about extreme events which are happening because the rain, it is not distributed the way it used to be. We used to say there is a monsoon season, but now within a week, and even in cities like Bangalore, Delhi, or even in Rajasthan, which were drought-prone areas, we have witnessed floods. We talk about sea level rise, and really speaking, it's also putting pressure on many of the industries where to put the infrastructure. Because with rising sea level, of course, it's going to be a problem in the coastal cities of India. It is also going to be a problem in other parts of the world. And it can be that the cities over a period of time will get submerged with water, and some of the cities perhaps will not exist on the maps even. We talk about the Himalayan glaciers. Of course, Africa won't be affected by it, but if we look at Asia, whether it's India, Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, now the melting of glacier has two impacts. One is that there is immediate increase in water in the river, but more than that, because once these glaciers have melted, where are we going to get water in the following years? Because the glaciers have already shrunk. So it is going to lead to water scarcity in the region. These are just to show that it's all over. It is not in one city. It is perhaps, I'm showing you like in Chennai, it's in south of India, it's a view of the airport. So your flights cannot take off. You're talking of Jammu and Kashmir. Look at it, like what will happen to the shops which are over there? They lose everything. and Kedarnath, that is a pilgrimage site. Now, over there, why I wanted to show you these is that whether it is Africa or Asia, we are poor countries comparatively. And therefore, if any event of this nature happens, people don't suffer, they don't only suffer that day or that year, perhaps they suffer for generations, because whatever they have built over years, they don't have insurance, they don't have money. There are, especially when we talk of Kedarnath, so many people have lost their lives. So with the result, it is that their entire family, they suffer for generations because of one event of this nature. Next one. So that is what I just wanted to show. If you see that, of course, there is a train which has fallen apart because the track has got broken. And when you talk of floods, then you don't see anything. The entire houses, they are submerged. So there is a sort of damage to human life as well as whatever little infrastructure is there. Now, if we look at IPCC, of course, they have warned us. And not only that, what they warned, and at that stage, it was that perhaps they want to create sensitization, but the actual impacts are far greater than what was predicted by IPCC. And of course, their working group 2 and 3, which was, I'll just talk about them a bit, impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. Now, what the report has identified, the increasing gaps between adaptation action taken and adaptation action needed. And that's where we say that we should have acted yesterday. We don't have any time. And these gaps are more prominent in lower income populations. So what we need to do is that first, of course, is we need to identify. And then adaptation actions, what are the efforts to ensure sustainable development and combat climate change? Kevin made an important point, and that is that we have to move towards cleaner or sustainable practices to save the planet. So I'll say planet will do very well without us. And we have seen it during COVID time. So 2 lessons which COVID has taught us. One is that whatever happens in one part of the globe is going to have impact on entire globe. Number 2 is that the nature can do very well without us. So when we were confined to the 4 walls of our house, we could see that biodiversity was much better. You could see birds which you are missing for many years. Your water, rivers had become cleaner. So really speaking, the planet or the nature can do much better without our interventions. And it is we who are creating problems, and then we blame the nature. And when we talk about climate finance, and we are saying that at least 50% of it should be allocated towards adaptation goals, it is not that the rich countries are trying to help developing nations. It's the other way around. First of all, they are the ones who have polluted the environment. They are to be blamed because whatever has happened so far is not due to efforts in Asia or Africa. It's largely from the other developed part of the world. And it was shown very clearly, even today, in terms of emissions per person per year, we are amongst the lowest. And if the entire globe comes down to this level, perhaps it will be a much better place. But they are not going to come down in terms of emissions. Rather, with growth, with economic growth, perhaps we are also going to move a bit in that direction. We should be sensitive towards it, how much we should permit, and should we go for cleaner options, which fortunately are available today. The other is that let's not try to put everything on the governments. It is perhaps responsibility of each one of us, and that is where the concept of life, that our lifestyles are going to be extremely important to determine our future. We can go back and look back. How have we grown? What was our childhood versus what our children are doing today? And we ourselves, the economic growth, the moment you become, I should say, if you are able to afford something, I'll say the very first thing we invest is in gadgets, whether it is a mobile phone. We want to have, perhaps even the TV at home should have a remote. We want to run air conditioning even at temperatures which you can manage otherwise. And then is mobility. You want to invest in car or at least a two-wheeler, so that what you are doing is that you are moving towards a comfort zone, which indirectly is also having negative impact on your health because you are not doing enough exercise. And then, of course, everything, even your computer monitor, is going to have impact on GHG emissions as a whole. And it's the entire life cycle that you have to look into, from its production to dismantling once you have thrown that gadget. Similarly, we are not conscious about, and again, I draw the example from the COVID, we don't really require the number of things we have accumulated over years. Look at the number of clothes. We all have wardrobes full of it. But do we ever think how much of GHG emissions are happening? Because even if you're buying a t-shirt, it's resulting in some GHG emissions, some use of natural resource, that is water. So ultimately, it is our greed which is putting enormous pressure on this planet. So this kind of involvement of stakeholders is extremely important, so that we move away from consumeristic society to a society where we value natural resources. Now, it is that we also have to realize that there is a very narrow window of taking action which is now available to us. We really have to move towards moving away from fossil fuels and going towards energy of efficiency as much as possible, renewable energy, and conservation and restoration of forests and lands, so that, or what we are talking today about, nature-based solutions. And happily, it has started happening. We are talking about carbon credits. Because see, when we talk about, and as I said, that involvement of every stakeholder is required, even a kitchen in rural India, how do they burn wood? What kind of wood they burn? That is ultimately going to have impact on emissions. We request them to invest on improved cook stoves. Of course, the direct benefit to them even today will be that in terms of biomass, they'll have to collect less, and also the indoor air pollution will be comparatively lesser. But usually these are the things for which you cannot have direct financial benefit. Now, can we develop a mechanism whereby a farmer or these populations in rural part of the country, they are given carbon credits? Because a traditional cook stoves will result in X amount of GHG emissions, versus if they have invested in improved cook stoves, we are at the savings in terms of carbon or emissions. So can we compensate them with financial benefit so that they are willing to invest in new technologies? Similarly, when we talk of agriculture sector, and I'm sure your country is no different from mine, we go for broadcasting of urea fertilizer. Now, fertilizer, again, because agriculture is very sensitive and we want food to be available to the larger population at affordable rate, there is huge subsidy on urea being offered. So it is a drain on the government. Now I get urea at a subsidized price, so I don't value that to that an extent. And therefore, the usual practices broadcast it in the field. So what happens to this precious fertilizer is that part of it, definitely it gets absorbed by the plant. Part of it gets converted into ammonia and it goes into the air, or we are polluting the air because of that. And quite a bit because of our agriculture practices, and especially because water is also over subsidized. So therefore, we believe in flood irrigation rather than going for drip and sprinkler or subsoil irrigation. So part of it also gets into the groundwater, further polluting. So it is one, but then for farmer, where is the incentive? If we tell him to invest in renewable, or rather in the sprinklers and all, for them there is no incentive. So can we also go towards green or the carbon credits which can be earned by the farmer so that they are financially benefited, and because of that they can be willing to invest in the technology as well. Now I did talk about life already, and I have discussed about that even a simple t-shirt which we don't even think twice before buying. We are talking about carbon emissions, which is in the CO2 emission, which is about 2.6 kg, and for a jean 11.5 kg. Now, if we develop a dashboard that is available to you and me, and at the end of the day, I say, okay, maybe my emissions for the day is so much, perhaps I'll become conscious before buying, because it is not only towards my paying capacity, it is also my consciousness that what is happening otherwise. And also what is happening, and that is where somewhere our research also has to move away from what we are doing. We have found that in most cases, people throw away clothes because they fade away. So therefore, maybe the research should be invested more in terms of dyes, which are more permanent, so that the cloth doesn't look old. So that kind of research also we have to go into. What I again want to say that today, fortunately, the youth is far more conscious compared to us, and they are aware and they really want to go ahead in cleaner technologies. So as mentioned earlier, I'll come to the other side of it, and that is that we have technologies available. I'll also say where we are better than perhaps other countries in the world. Because whether it is Asia, India, Africa, the good part is that we still have to build our infrastructure. So it is not that something already exists, and therefore we look into that if I break this, create new infrastructure, what is going to be that cost? Rather, since I have to construct most of my infrastructure, I can look into where are the options available. We are talking about compressed natural gas. It's again killing two birds with one stone, because we have so much of agriculture residue, which is either burnt or utilized in the most inefficient manner. Can we go for CNG production? Whatever, once you have produced the gas, the leftover slurry is a good rich manure, and again it will help in further reduction of GHG because your urea demand will go down. Electric vehicle, very good, but then it is not just going for electric vehicle. You have to do the life cycle analysis, that because there is additional emissions with electric, with the manufacturing of EV, then what kind of run it should do to justify? Do we have the infrastructure? Because again, if you're generating electricity from coal, it is no more a clean technology. You have to produce electricity from solar or one of the renewable sources.
I'm sorry,
Hydrogen.
Dr. Dawan, due to the time constraint, kindly summarize your presentation within 1 minute. Sorry, and thank you.
Okay. So hydrogen, the entire world is talking about it. What I would like to say in the end is that what is required is partnerships, and because technologies are available, but it's not going to be plug and play. We have to develop technologies, fine tune them to our requirements, that is small and medium enterprises, small farmers, and that is where we require partnerships between the two countries. And let's not neglect the West, because they will also give us the technologies which can be fine tuned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dawan, for your brilliant suggestions about the way forward. We would like to listen to you more in the discussion session afterwards. Thank you so much once again. And let me now introduce Dr. Jung-woo Kim, Executive Director of the Global Knowledge Exchange and Development Center and the Center for International Development at the Korea Development Institute called KDI. Since joining KDI in 2007, Dr. Kim has accumulated diverse experience in both policy research and project management. He had also held various executive positions at the KDI as a director and vice president of the Department of Industry and Competition Policy, as a director of the Center of Regulatory Studies. Currently, Dr. Kim is responsible for designing, executing, and delivering the knowledge sharing program known as Korea's KSP and other development cooperation projects with multiple partners, including multilateral development banks, including African Development Bank, UN agency, and partner government. It is our great honor to have you today, Dr. Kim. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Yuna. I'd like to make it really quick because we are so behind the schedule, and I think Q&A session or discussion following my presentation is more valuable than mine. So let me just briefly talk about the climate change and adjusted energy transition in Africa based upon the Korean experience and some recommendations. So I'd like to just skip over those things with a short notice, because even though the Africa shares lower than any other continent in global carbon emissions, but the burden from the climate change on those economies are so huge. That means it's unproportionally suffers a lot from the climate changes. So the African countries should get some attention from the global society, of course, but it is not happening yet. And also the burden does not limit to the climate, rather it directly harms some daily life of the African citizens. You can see that the the healthcare costs is higher or way higher than the any other countries. So the African countries suffer a lot from the climate changes, and that has some kind of impact, really negative impact on the quality of life in African society. But there is a strong demand and huge demand for those climate changes. However, the affordable budget is really low, so around 10% of the necessary budgets. So you cannot mobilize public expenditure or public budget allocations, because there's a big gap between demand and supply for the financial areas. And you cannot rest on the private sector's investment, because private finance accounts for only 14% of those things. So even though you want to actively anticipate the private engagement in the climate change financing, you face that there's a lack of huge gap behind those issues. So actually, the Africa needs more money, more resources, more attention for those climate change issues. Recently, Korea announced the Green New Deal, And also, it is not domestically announced whether international agendas such as Green New Deal ODA is already included on those pictures. So you can see that there's some climate changes, the climate-related ODA. Korea has a bigger chunk of the entire share. Also, the total volume of the bilateral ODA for climate has increased just before the pandemic. And during the pandemic, most of the ODA was focused on the public safety or health issues to prevent and to minimize the pandemic, to take care of the global issue. However, Korean New Deal deals with the great transformation from gray to green. So it also promotes the Green New Deal ODA strategy, because we are really interested in greening, and we'd like to expand our international cooperative work or efforts to facilitate or enhance the greenness over the globe, including African countries. So there are 3 pillars for the Green New Deal ODA strategy. So fit for partner countries and leading global discussions and initiatives in greenness, and nurture the promotion of the partnerships, of course. So there are key factors. So we'd like to support Green New Deal ecosystem in developing countries, not just the public side, whether we try to build up the sound ecosystem with the private sectors, along with the public sector as well. And also, we'd like to focus on the green energy and eco-friendly mobility in developing countries. And we try to implement the flagship projects tailored to partner countries. So not just one best practice, rather we try to tailor and make a kind of customized solutions based upon each and every country's case. So, and also we aim to improve the scope and measurement method for Green ODA. So that is key factors we try to address. Recommendations. So instead of Green ODA start in abruptly, rather we try to focus on the greening ODA or greener ODA. So the traditional ODA is needed and necessary for the conventional infrastructure or programs or medical services. So not just start with from the scratch, rather incumbents, the demand for the ODA survive and sustain. So we try to make it in greener way. So deliver with the eco-friendly method, or longevity buildings can be delivered via those greening ODA, or pursuing the greener ODA, the things. And we do have kind of criteria for selecting those issues. So we have climate risk management indexes. So when green indexes will enhanced, then you can expect more or much greener ODA in your hands, and then project will be delivered via those measurements. Also, we aim to like environmental goals, like contributing to the environmental goals, and safeguards will be another way to boost up the economic activities in greener way. So those things are our recommendation. So in short, we'd like to invite private sectors, and private sector participation or active engagement is crucial in green ODA or greening ODA to take care of the issues in African countries. And so public sectors should to invite private sectors, also support private sectors engagements with more infrastructure built on time and in time. Also reshape of the ODA, not just global development financing restructuring, rather we try to mobilize affordable resources into the greener ODA, or make a framework in the long run to get a green ODA in African countries or other regions as well. And also start with the greening or greener ODA is necessary in order to start immediately for achieving or taking those ultimate goals, and to take care of the African countries in various ways. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim, for your enlightening presentation and also innovative recommendation for the future cooperation between Africa and Korea and in Asia overall. It is good to, personally, it is good to learn about the upgraded official development assistant ODA, the greening ODA, which is pretty the innovative, and also it's good to hear again that the role of the importance of the private sector. Thank you once again, Dr. Kim. So let's now turn to the open session of the event, the discussion. The 3 presenters and 2 economists from the African Development Bank will actively join this session. Please let me introduce my dear colleagues, 2 economists briefly. First, Dr. Anthony Simpasa. He is a lead economist for Nigeria and acting manager for macroeconomic policy, debt sustainability, and forecasting division. And the second economist, Dr. Adamo Mukasa. He is the principal research economist in the same department. And Dr. Mukasa is one of the drafters of the African Economic Outlook report, and he's has widely published in a different sector. And also, let me introduce Mr. Naoshige Kinoshita, who is a moderator for this discussion session. Mr. Kinoshita is the deputy head of the AFDB Asia office. He has over 25 years of professional experience in project management, ECA, project finance, and M&A in the energy and infrastructure business field, particularly in Africa. Before joining the AFDB Asia office, he was a chief investment officer at Energy Financial Solution Policy and Regulation at the bank's headquarters. So I will now pass the floor to Mr. Kinoshita to moderate the session.
Okay, so thank you very much, Yuna-san, for the introduction. I'm Naoshige Kinoshita. Actually, it is a very great honor to and a pleasure to moderate this panel with distinguished 5 panelists. So let's move to a discussion session. For the constraints of the time, it would be very helpful if each of you limit around 2 to 3 minutes for your answer. Okay, so the first question would be for Dr. Kim. Thank you for the wonderful presentation regarding Green ODA, and also you mentioned a little bit about private sector investment in the presentation. And this is regarding about energy transition. And the question would be, how has the war in Ukraine changed the dialogue around climate finance, especially in the regard of to an investment in natural gas, including liquefied natural gas? You could talk about not just about African context, but as a Korean and Asian context. And of course, gas is something, BP Urama mentioned in the presentation in the beginning as a transition source. So the first question to Dr. Kim, floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, as uncertainty in the traditional energy market rises due to the Russia-Ukrainian war, securing a stable and sustainable energy supply chain is emphasized globally, as well as the strengthening energy security through the green transition, of course. In the case of Korea, since nearly 95% of Korean energy resource relies upon the foreign imports, we see Africa as a new cooperation partner, emerging an important role in energy mix with its abundant natural resources such as natural gas, mineral, and renewable energy resources. As per the current energy crisis we are facing, most countries are looking for alternative energy resources. In particular, the European Commission recently presented a final draft of the Complementary Climate Delegated Act, and it classified nuclear and natural gas as green energy in the EU taxonomy. Additionally, in the case of Korea, there is an active discussion on whether nuclear power should be included in the K taxonomy as well. In addition, this indicates that the role of natural gas in the decarbonization process has been highly recognized, and investment in natural gas development and infrastructure construction should be expanded from a medium-term perspective. As a result, Africa is expected to benefit from the Green Deal or ESG-related investment in natural gas sector. In Africa, the level of gas production has not only increased in traditional natural gas exporting countries such as Algeria, Nigeria, and Egypt, but also more than 20 natural gas development projects are scheduled to begin by 2035, which are currently in feasibility study and confirmation stages. So since uncertainty in natural gas supply and demand is expected to intensify, I think it is necessary for governments to expand overseas energy development projects in such a way that they collaborate with domestic and foreign private companies to stabilize the supply chain. So reflecting on a successful public-private partnership PPP projects experience of Coral FLNG in Mozambique, which was built in South Korea by Samsung and now is achieving its LNG cargo, adding Mozambique to the LNG producing countries. I hope that we can make more successful cases in other parts of the African continent with this. Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Kim, thank you very much for mentioning very positive, regarding gas development. And even you mentioned about a particular project in Mozambique. And of course, the bank is involved in development of the gas sector in the bank. And of course, as an energy transition, it is quite important. Yeah, so because of the time constraints, I would like to move to the second question, which is for Dr. Dawang from Terry. And the question would be, could South-South alliances and a partnership provide alternative to the current lopsided global climate finance architecture? How could such partnership be structured and financed? This is a little bit tricky question, but the floor is yours. Thank you.
We are discussing about South-South collaboration since 1978 or so. And I suppose that is the only solution, because I believe in that the technologies which have been developed in the Western countries, there is no model as plug and play. You need to modify those technologies, and because it is also that the scale at which they work versus our socio-economic conditions, they are totally different. And therefore, the South-South collaboration is essential. The other aspect is when we look at technology development, the cost of technology development in our countries is far lower than what it is in the West. So therefore, the only way going forward is that you have to work in partnership, both for developing new technologies as well as fine-tuning the existing technologies for using in our countries. Now you talk of finance. Yes, finance is an important part. Part of it, definitely we are talking of carbon financing. We are talking about the developed part, which has actually done the damage to the environment. They should actually pay, they can afford it. But at the same time, nothing is going to work if we ask for subsidies. I believe what we should do is carbon financing is required, but that should become like the initial fund. And thereafter, from the benefits, we should be able to generate more and take the technology to the next step. And believe me, that cost of technology development is going to be far lower in our part of the world. It is also that the technology which is developed or already developed overseas, if we want to put it for use by masses, it has to be fine-tuned in our countries. And then we have similar conditions, and therefore why to reinvent the broken wheel? We can work together and take the technology to the next stage of commercialization. And it also holds true for human resource development. And what we also perhaps somewhere need is that we should, rather than going for PhD, which is more PhD oriented, the research should be mission oriented, with students from both the countries, both the continents, Asia, Africa, or the South.
Yeah.
So I'll say tripartite, but the two of the South, and maybe the developed part, so that you also have access to best of the technology.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Dr. Dawang, and this event is because the beauty is between Asia and Africa is so it's not just a developing country, but the developed country, but the different continent. And I'm really impressed with your wording, fine-tuning the existing technology and carbon financing in the beginning, the first part, and it's eventually going to develop in the future. That is very fruitful and insightful comments. Thank you very much. So, okay, so the next question would be our colleague, Dr. Anthony Simparsa. The question would be, what innovative financing instrument could be developed to support climate resilience and just energy transition in African countries? This is a core question in this event. So floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor, for the question. But let me pay special tribute to the three presenters, Kevin and the two professors from KDI and India. I think they put out a very strong case for the just energy transition, including the need for innovative financing to unlock investment in climate-related issues in Africa, but also in other developing countries, including in Asia. I see essentially three main areas where we can attract innovative financing, particularly focusing on the role of the private sector, given that we know already that public financing is very limited and the countries are going through a lot of challenges, trying to recover from COVID-19 and other shocks. So private financing will be critical, but what does it require? I think we will need to start exploring the opportunities in sustainability-linked bonds and loans specifically, that's embedding them climate risks from that will be amenable to the private sector. Essentially, we're looking at issues of blended finance as well, which, as you know, is an avenue that can help attract private financing by de-risking some of the climate-related infrastructure or climate-related projects in all the different spheres. I recall also one element that we have probably not explored that much, both in the report, but also in the discussion that we've had today. That is that many countries now are looking to urban renewal, increasing climate smart infrastructure, producing, creating opportunities for low carbon emitting vehicles and so on. But we also know that the main cities in Africa, especially, do not have the capacity, at least presently, to explore opportunities for green bonds that will help create or attract investment in urban renewal. So the green city bonds, I think, present an important innovative source of financing to develop green infrastructure that will support the greening of our cities. We saw the pictures that were presented for the case of India, and that is not uncommon in the case of Africa as well. Here where I'm sitting in Nigeria, we have had massive flooding that have decimated some of the roads, as well as disrupting logistics. So attracting private investment in some of the urban renewal projects, I think, is key to developing resilient infrastructure that responds to ravages of climate change. The last point that I could probably talk about, and this speaks to smallholder farmers especially, that rely predominantly on traditional agricultural practices, is that provide them with opportunities for climate smart agriculture, opportunities that will help them reduce the carbon footprint in the agricultural practices is key. But this will require developing carbon markets that will help them to realize the potential that is in the carbon trading. I have an example that I can share with you, which has over the past couple of months gained a lot of traction, and that is involving the community, both the traditional leaders at local level, but also the community in understanding the benefits of climate finance and the effects of climate change on the agricultural produce is very important. In Zambia recently, one of the leading community action groups in partnership with the Shell and the Zambian government has realized and validated the reduction in carbon footprint of about 0.9 metric tons and rewarded local farmers millions of dollars to help them continue with the same conservation practices that help them to reduce the carbon footprint. So there are many ways in which we can attract financing in climate related issues, but we also need to engender the issue of gender, and we need to incorporate and mainstream gender in all the issues that focus on attracting financing in some of these areas that I've talked about. We could say more a little bit, and some of these things we've already articulated in the project, the report, and the Professor Urama also had talked about them. But I think those are the three issues that I wanted to highlight in addition to what has already been said. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. Yeah, it's very, important. You mentioned about green bonds and carbon footprinting, carbon footprint and new wave of sort of trading in relation to community and agriculture, which is very interesting idea. Thank you very much. And next question would be to Dr. Mukasa Adaman. The question would be, what are the roles of multilateral development finance institutions in reshaping and redesigning global climate finance models to make them fit for the needs of African countries? This is a very important question. Floor is yours. Thank you, Adamu.
Yes, indeed. This is a very good question, a very important question, especially for Africa. I think we have heard from Professor Urama that there is a mismatch between Africa's national determined contributions, NDCs, and climate finance. And there is that problem of the global climate finance architecture. So the question is indeed very important. So I think there are at least three main roles that the multilateral development finance institutions, such as the development financial institutions and multilateral development bank, can play in order to help in reshaping and redesigning the global finance model. I think the first one, they should really lead by example. I think that is key. They should really lead in example by providing more concessional finance instruments, but also grant for climate change. I think this has been made clear during the presentation. So this morning, before this session, I was just looking at the latest joint report on MDZ climate finance. And what struck me was that 70% of their total climate finance commitment, which were around 66 billion, were through investment loans. So we are talking about MDBs, but 6% of their climate finance commitment were on loans, and only 5% were just in terms of grants. And if you make a comparison between 2020, which was the year of the latest report, and you go back to 2016, now the climate finance loans was just 73%. What does this mean? It means that between 2026 and 2020, we have MDBs have become increasingly more debt-oriented than they used to be in the past. So I think for me, this has to change. They have to lead by example, and for that, they need to provide more concessional financing instruments instead of increasing the share of investors' loans that they are providing to development country. And I think it will be also important in that regard that to emphasize the need of very ambitious replenishment of these institutions, because they are really crucial in terms of boosting mitigation and adaptation finance. So for me, that is the first key point that they have to play. They need to show good examples by providing more concessional financing. I think the second role they should play, I think they should leverage their structure to endorse not only a clear push for meeting and even exceeding the 100 billion commitment by developed country, but also they should really push for a deep reform of the global climate finance architecture. Why? Simply because if you look at the structure of these FDIs and MDBs, what you will notice that advanced economies, developed countries are important shareholders of this institution. So you have among them people who can make things change. For example, in the case of the African Development Bank, we have like 40% of our shareholders are outside Africa, and the majority of them, they are developed countries. So you find the same kind of structure in other MDBs. So I think that MDBs can take advantage of that structure and start initiating internal debates with their developed country shareholders on how we can make the current global climate finance architecture fit for developed countries in general and African country in particular. For example, what we have seen that most climate finance funds and even trust funds, they are hosted in those developed countries. And as Professor Rama explained during his presentation, so reforming the global climate finance architecture will also imply improving the functioning of these funds. So MDBs and FDIs can play a very important role in that regard by initiating very profound internal debates. And finally, and I will stop there, I think these institutions, they are one of the main interfaces between the public and the private sectors. And Anthony was explaining just before me that we need really to attract the private sector. And this is one of the key weaknesses of the current global climate finance architecture. So I think MDBs can play that role, being the interface between the public sector and the private sectors when it comes to climate finance. So they can help not only scaling up the public climate finance, but also they can help in crowding in the private sector. So I think these three roles should be played by the private by MDBs and FDIs if you want to reform the current global finance architecture. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Adoban. It's fantastic answers talking about more concessional loans, grant, and structural changes and place MDB's role. You know, the shareholders, developed countries and African countries, we are providing African voice in COP26, and probably we will provide more voices in the COP27 after a few weeks. And of course, PPP, public-private relations, is extremely important. Thank you very much, Adamo. And the last question would be VP Urama, and this is an extremely important question. And how is the AFDB advancing a climate finance architecture more favorable to African countries? How can we leverage the partnership with Asian economies to deliver on climate finance to Africa? Yeah, of course, you mentioned about climate action window based on ADF in the presentation and etc. But this is more like relationship, partnership with Asian economies. So floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. And for the African Development Bank Group has really been a leader in terms of championing, climate transitions in Africa. And there are several initiatives that the African Development Bank has instituted as vehicles. We have AFAC, which is a financing, collaboration with finance ministers and central bank governors, and also the private sector, to help mobilize climate finance for Africa. But we also are hosting the Africa Global Adaptation Initiative that is aimed at mobilizing up to $25 billion in climate financing for Africa. And if we talk about partnerships with Asia, it is His Excellency Ban Ki-moon who is actually leading the global effort on these adaptation initiatives and working with the African Development Bank very, very closely. And through several initiatives that we have, because like I've mentioned before, climate financing for us in Africa is about development financing. And as you know, we have several initiatives that we are working with China, like the China Africa Energy Financing Facility that is focusing on mobilizing cleaner energy options for Africa. All these are parts of how to finance climate on the continent. And then we see a lot of collaboration that can be done with Asian continent, especially Japan, South Korea, China, India, and so on, in terms of technology sharing and knowledge sharing. A lot of the work that JICA does with us, the TICAD work that we're doing together, all these are platforms through which we can actually accelerate green development on the continent. Because for me, the issue of divulging climate finance from development in general in Africa is like a misnomer. So actually, those platforms are very veritable for us. And also, if I speak specifically about Japan that is hosting this, Japan is known for its quality infrastructure, and so is other countries in Asia, like South Korea, India, and the rest of them. So those technology sharing that will allow Africa to transit to cleaner development pathways are very good ways of supporting climate financing and adaptation finance in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, VP, for the last wonderful comments and in relation to adaptation initiative and technology sharing and more solid infrastructures that we have to make it. And yeah, I wish we would like to continue the whole discussion, but I think we are almost over the time. So I think I should give the floor back to Yuna-san. And I guess Q&A session, we cannot have it, right? So I guess a lot of questions has been already answered by writing. So yeah, Yuna-san, give the floor back to you. Thank you.
ThAnk you very much, Mr. Kinoshita, for moderating this very informative session, and thank all the speakers for their excellent, thought-provoking talks. And yes, as Mr. Kinoshita mentioned, that we wish to have more time to this discussion time, but yeah, we can do. Hopefully, we can do next year again with Asian audiences. And most importantly, also, I would like to thank all the participants. Without your input and great questions, this event would not have been the success it has. So we answered lively all 21 questions from the floor via chat box and via Q&A chat box. Yeah, a few points before I close the event that I also wanted to salute the effort and great support of our colleagues at the Asia office and the ECMR and African Development Institute called ADI team, and also Dr. Eric Ogunleye, acting manager of AFDB Policy Management Division. And we also greatly appreciated the support from the IT staff members, Tanya Dorsaf, and Communication Department, Yolan and Raquel, in covering our event, and also the 10 excellent interpreters interpreters, and also we are grateful to all those who have been involved in organizing the event, especially India's Energy and Resources Institute, TERI, and Korea's Korea Development Institute. Before closing the event, I wanted to share the information about the AFDB's Asian language website in Chinese, Japanese, and Korea, which were launched in 2015 and have been managed by the AFDB Asia office. The latest information on AFDB's initiative, project activities, and upcoming events will be available on the website. And also please note that today's presentation slides will be also posted on this Asian language website in a few days. Also, you can download the AO highlights in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean that have already been published and posted on the Asian website. So please check them out. So thank you so much to each one of you for actively participating in today's event. We thank you and we will be in touch, and please stay safe. Thank you.